Our next guest is Stan Gadek, President and CEO of Canada Jetlines. Stan joined Canada Jetlines as its CEO in June 2017 and has been working hard to start operations which are now slated for summer of 2018. Stan has spent his entire career in the airline industry working with several U.S. carriers such as United Express, Continental, Northwest, AirTran, and most recently Sun Country, where he was President, CEO, and CFO. Stan, thank you for coming to our conference.
Thank you. Come around here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I think we've got a very exciting story to talk about.
Absolutely. So I guess starting up an airline is obviously not an easy gig. Maybe you can walk us through some of your plans over the next little while, all the way up to sort of commercial flying.
Sure. Well, first of all, I got to tell you, it's very exciting to be here, and furthermore, to be starting what's going to be Canada's first truly ultra-low-cost carrier. The airfare structure here in this country is just out of whack. We all know that. And so the objective of our project is to change that. Now, there's a lot of steps that are involved with it. But first of all, it starts with having a logical and well thought out business plan, which is what we spent a significant amount of time working on. Number two, it's in crafting that value proposition for the customer to make them to want to acquire your service and fly in your airline. So we've spent a lot of time developing our business plan. We've got a very comprehensive financial model. We've done extensive market research. Last week, we just opened up our investor data room, which I'm very pleased to announce. And we already have expressions of interest from significant players in the airline space in terms of investment. Our initial focus is on raising foreign capital. Frankly, there's a lack of risk capital in Canada to start up an ultra-low-cost carrier in this country. And the greatest success in this sector has been in the international marketplaces with carriers such as Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz, Tiger Air, Spirit, Allegiant, the list goes on and on. And I'm happy to say that we are getting some expressions of strong interest from key players in this space internationally who have been participants in some of the most successful ultra-low-cost carrier startups in the world. And we're looking forward to getting our CAs signed up and getting them in the data room. They're going to find a very comprehensive plan, and I think they're going to be impressed with the quality of work that's gone into this. We spent a lot of time building a team that can not only execute on this plan, but can change literally aviation history here in Canada. It comes with experience. Our board has two prominent directors who have direct operating experience with ultra-low-cost carriers in Europe. Saad Hamad, who was the Chief Commercial Officer of EasyJet. I'm sure you've heard of EasyJet. You may have actually used EasyJet in Europe. As well as John Stevenson, who was with Saad. And then John went on to become Chief Commercial Officer of Wizz, which is an Eastern European ultra-low-cost carrier. Both of those gentlemen are on our board. Myself, previously with AirTran, which was a low-cost carrier, it was eventually purchased by Southwest Airlines. And then most recently, Sun Country Airlines in Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, 737 operator, a low-cost carrier model. Our model is an ultra-low-cost carrier model. The difference is we will offer the absolute lowest base fare in the marketplace. And I will tell you that on average, our base fares will be below $100. Additional services will be available for ancillary fees, but we've got to be careful about ancillary revenue. And people have said, well, we'll just double our ancillary revenue. Well, I can tell you it's not that easy. And so we have assumptions with respect to our ancillary revenue that'll make us profitable. It's all detailed in our business plan. But I will tell you that simply making the statement that we're going to be able to double our ancillary revenue is not realistic. And I have lived in that world. I collected fees at Sun Country Airlines. We also did it at AirTran. Both John and Saad have had experience at EasyJet and at Wizz. And it is very tough to lever those ancillary fees. Why, would you ask, if you're offering a low base fare? Because the customer ultimately looks at the total price that they're going to pay. And yes, it's important for them to understand what the charge is for baggage and seat assignment and beverages and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, the customer is going to make their decision based on that final dollar amount. And so you can't get carried away with charging ancillary fees. You have to offer something that is a value proposition to that customer. So investor data room's open. We've got expressions of interest. We're focusing now on foreign ownership because that's where the risk capital is available for startups in this sector. And we're going to be conducting investor meetings here in the very near future. Our goal is to secure our next round of financing by the end of this year or early first quarter. We have it tranched in phases, and we will have our startup of operations on June 1st. There's a lot of operational details that go into starting an airline, not the least of which is securing aircraft. We're going to operate the 737-800 aircraft. Part of the model is simplicity, and that means simplicity of the fleet, because it all comes down to costs. You have to be the lowest cost operator in the market. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's all about low cost, low cost, low cost, low costs, so that you can offer the lowest fare. That's your product. You know, a lot of people will say, well, you can control your price. No, you can't. The only thing an airline can control is its costs. The customer controls the price. They determine the price at which the market clears for a given route. And it's up to the airline and the management specifically then to have a cost structure that would allow the airline to be profitable. So costs are very important. Simplicity of fleet, very important. It also has to be a volume-based model. And so as we start up in summer of 2018, we'll be starting with an initial focus city in Hamilton, Ontario here. Why? Because we have over 8.5 million people, by some estimates 10 million people in the greater metropolitan area here in Toronto, and that's what we need to start the carrier. We're going to be having a multi-base strategy as we move forward. So in 2018, we'll start in Hamilton. We have a very conservative growth plan of 4 aircraft per year over 6 years, 24 aircraft. In 2019, we've already announced that we're going to be setting up Abbotsford, British Columbia, as our West Coast focus city of operation there. And as we continue to progress forward, and in the near future, hopefully I would like to get into the Montreal area, assuming the airports can address the congestion issues there. Another vast market of customers. And so by deploying this multi-base strategy, we'll be able to keep our costs down because we won't be overnighting crews in hotels and things like that, such as traditional airlines have to do. And we'll be adding more service to destinations that matter to those customers in those markets. So there's a lot of work to do, hiring of employees, training them, not the least of which is getting the certifications with Transport Canada as well as CTA, which I'm pleased to say is ahead of schedule. And we're proud of that and working very hard with the authorities, such that on June 1 we'll be ready to go.
So I guess maybe we talk a little bit about that June 1st deadline in terms of if you want to be ready to go on June 1st, you got to probably start selling tickets in January or February at the latest, right? In terms of
probably about 90 days in advance.
Oh, just 3 months? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The average booking curve for us will be somewhere between 45 to 90 days. Will be a much simpler operation, and so we should be able to start selling in the March-April timeframe.
Okay, but then you still have to get an AOC.
Mm-hmm.
You still need, obviously, to set up all the infrastructure, mm-hmm. And you need to get financing. You think it just seems like a bit of a tight deadline to me, or am I mistaken? Yeah,
there's a lot of work to do for sure. We already have teams working on these different aspects of it. For instance, we have an AOC team that's working. A number of gentlemen from some other airlines who actually have experience in obtaining certification with Transport Canada. That team's making excellent progress, for sure. We have a very detailed build-out plan for the airline. in terms of the different functional areas that have to be addressed and the requirements in terms of recruiting and staffing individuals. I get asked the question about pilot supply. How are you going to attract pilots? Do you think you're going to have a problem with pilots? I will tell you, we're already getting applications from people just being sent in by pilots that are flying in the Gulf and in Asia. And for sure, we will need experienced captains on day one. But what's also remarkable to me is that we're getting inquiries from a number of first officers, some of whom are with the major carriers, who don't see the promotional opportunities for themselves that a carrier such as Jetlines would afford to them. Let me talk a little bit about that. From a pilot perspective, career earnings is very important to them. And so how do you maximize career earnings? It's kind of like a professional athlete. How do I maximize my career earnings as a pilot? Because pilots invest a tremendous amount of money in their career and obtaining their licenses, significant amounts of money. Well, if you're sitting in the right seat, which is a first officer seat, you're the co-pilot, whatever term you want to call it, and you're flying a 50-seat regional jet, or you're flying a narrow-body airplane at one of the major carriers, the only way you're going to maximize your career earnings is by moving over to the left seat and becoming a captain. And this is exactly part of the strategy that Air Canada followed when they set up with Rouge, and they were able to obtain productivity improvements from the pilots, because the quid pro quo that they offered the pilots at Air Canada to move to Rouge was a greater promotional opportunity and a quicker path to upgrade, resulting in higher career earnings. So pilots are seeing that with Jetlines. It's a startup carrier. They're going to see the rapid growth eventually, although our plan is conservative, and they're going to be in on the ground floor. The other thing that's going to attract the pilots is the multi-base strategy. And what that simply means is that you get to go home every night. In the traditional airline world, you're sitting out in some hotel in some remote location, and your life is a series of hotel rooms after hotel rooms after hotel rooms. With our multi-base strategy, we accomplish two things. One, I've already mentioned, we reduce our costs because we're not having to put crews up in hotels every night, which is very expensive. And number two, we improve the quality of life for the pilot in being home, if not every night, then most of the nights. They have family lives too. And I can tell you from personal experience, and I happen to be a pilot, don't hold that against me, but I'd rather be at home than sitting in some cold hotel room someplace.
Okay. I guess maybe talk a little bit about one of the big arguments against the ULCC model in Canada. Certainly is sort of a sparse population, huge geography. I'd say probably a fairly small VFR market compared to some of the other countries. So just maybe talk about that. How would you respond to that in terms of the potential market out there for ULCC?
Sure, and thank you for that question. It's a great question. You know, we've heard the comment from some people that the market's not big enough for more than one ULCC. I have one word for that, bupkis, and I will tell you why. I have sized the market at 17 million customers over the next 5 years, or actually at year 5, 2023. I'll tell you how I did it. I took 2016 statistics from Statistics Canada for domestic as well as transborder U.S. customers. I grew that at a 3.5% CAGR rate, which is very modest. And then I assumed a market penetration from ULCCs starting at 1% in 2018 of that total market size, growing to only 12.5% over the next 5 years. ULCCs around the world have demonstrated a penetration rate of anywhere from 15 to 20% of the existing market. My projection at 12.5% over 5 years gets me to 17 million people as a market opportunity. There's no way I can service 24 million or 17 million people with 24 aircraft. In fact, even if you put Swoop into the mix, there's still more than enough demand. Now, where's that demand going to come from? It's going to come from two categories. It's going to come from new demand stimulation, and that's going to consist of people who either aren't flying today because of high airfares or people who want to fly more if the airfares were cheaper. And it also comes from a second category, and that's called share shift. It's market share shift from incumbent carriers that are charging high fares. And then there's a third category, overall growth in the marketplace. So my response to the comment that the market's only big enough for one is no way. In fact, at my conservative growth plan of only 4 airplanes per year, growing into a 17 million market opportunity at a 12.5 percentage point penetration rate, I think is significantly understated, number one. Number two, people talk about the geography. Well, actually, geography works in our favor here in Canada because you need means of rapid air transportation or transportation in general, and that being air travel, to cover these long distances. We don't have highly developed rail systems like you do in Europe where you would have alternative means of land travel. So that works in our favor. In terms of the population of Canada itself, our model will generate volume not only from the Canadians that are traveling domestically, but also Canadians that are going deep south. And in the wintertime, our strategic plan shifts from a focus on domestic Canada and select points in the United States in the summer to a wintertime focus of points in Florida, multiple points I might add, Canada and Mexico. This is a strategy I followed at Sun Country Airlines. It was very successful. We made most of our money in the wintertime. I don't know why it gets cold in Minnesota just like it does here in Canada, so I think that model will be very similar as well. So the combination of a very sizable market opportunity as well as having a very compelling value proposition, and as I've said, our base fares will be under $100 on average. We're going to have some base fares on a promotional basis that may be as cheap as $10, but I can guarantee you on average they'll be less than $100. That's significantly lower than anything that's out there in the marketplace. Is our product for everyone? Absolutely not. But I'll tell you what, I think there's a lot of people out there that want cheaper airfares that don't fly today, and I know for a fact, and I've talked to some of them today, who would probably be interested in share shift as well, at least on an occasional basis compared to the airfares that they're paying for.
There's a question there.
Hi. Any details is much appreciated, what you can share, but I'm just curious, what kind of load factors do you need to break even? And when do you expect that to occur by?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know the answer. It's in the data room. I will tell you that as we start up with 4 airplanes, our efficiencies of scale will grow as we continue to add aircraft and build out the operation. So break-even load factor on day one will be much higher than what it'll be 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road. I can tell you this, that we will be at cash break-even within the first 12 full months of operation. It's a great question.
I guess if you look through history here, like the path is definitely strewn with airlines that have come and failed, right?
Yeah.
And you look at competition in Canada, probably wasn't as strong as it is today with both Air Canada, WestJet being pretty strong players overall. And they both have a flanker brand now with Rouge and Swoop that's making your life probably more difficult. So just, why are you so confident in your business model? Maybe talk a little bit about the cost structure.
Sure. Well, I am confident because I know it's going to work, and I've seen it work. And I'd like to talk about the competitive aspect of this first, primarily Swoop. We've heard a lot about Swoop, and Swoop is definitely going to compete with us. I believe we'll have competition from Rouge as well as Air Canada. Although Air Canada is a much different carrier, it's international in scope, it's complex. I think our primary competition will come from Swoop. Let me be clear about something, and this is my personal opinion. There's one objective that Swoop has, and that's to eliminate competition. That's right. It's not about bringing lower fares to Canada. It's not about creating more travel opportunities for Canadians. That's baloney. There's one objective here for Swoop, and that is to eliminate competition. And so we are prepared to deal with that. We've studied the Competition Act. We understand the case law that's been made, some of it by WestJet themselves when they initially got started with Air Canada. And we intend to aggressively defend ourselves in the event of any anti-competitive actions. Now, the best defense is having the lowest costs in the marketplace. And I know for a fact we're going to have the absolute lowest costs. Let's talk about that. Where are we going to get the lowest costs from? First of all, I'm starting with a clean sheet of paper when it comes to salaries, wages, and benefits. We've talked about pilots. I would make the argument for you that I could actually offer a lower base salary to a pilot than what exists currently at the mainline carriers because of the promotional opportunities, quality of life, profit sharing, employee stock purchase plan, et cetera. But in addition to that, we're going to outsource as much as possible. I would outsource the entire airline if I could, including management, quite frankly. But I can't with respect to pilots or flight attendants. Everything else I can outsource. Above the wing, meaning your ticket agents. Below the wing, your ground handlers, your baggage handlers, your fuelers, even your maintenance. And so when we begin looking at, and I'll just do the comparison to Swoop here, when you begin looking at what are the opportunities for Swoop to lower its costs, they're few and far between. Labor groups, unless you're going to go out and hire all new people, you're not going to get the cost savings there. In terms of distribution, one of the largest costs for an airline, and this is the cost of how you sell your tickets. I'll give you an example. When I was at Sun Country, we were a part of Sabre, and Sabre relies on travel agencies. It's a global distribution system. It's very important if you're flying internationally around the world. But a carrier like us, not so much. It just drives costs. The average booking fee at Sun Country for me was $8 to $18 per booking. Guess who pays for that? Not the airline. In our distribution system, we're going to distribute exclusively over the internet. We're not going to be in the GDSs. We're not going to be in the OTAs. My average booking fee is going to be 35 to 50 cents. There's been talk about Swoop. They're going to have a system called Navitaire, which is very popular among ultra-low-cost carriers. But that system, in and of itself, doesn't guarantee low distribution costs if you're still distributing through the GDS systems and the OTAs. I don't know if Swoop is going to totally divorce himself from that distribution or not. We'll see. Maintenance. We are going to outsource maintenance, and that can be effectively managed by a core cadre within the airline. Swoop, they're going to use their own maintenance people. Again, I don't know where you're going to get the cost savings from. Fuel is fuel, aircraft is aircraft. The third category is in overhead, and there absolutely I will have the lowest costs because we will have a very efficient workforce. I'll give you a couple statistics here. If you really want to get a quick perspective on an airline's efficiency, calculate something that's called full-time equivalents per aircraft. Very simple calculation. Take the total employees divided by the total number of airplanes. And it's an effective metric to at least ballpark where the productivity is in the organization. So if you look at an Air Canada, which is a very complex airline, they fly around the world, it's relatively high. When I was at AirTran, our full-time equivalents per aircraft were about 55, 54. We were always neck and neck with Southwest Airlines. And the goal was to actually be better than them, and we actually achieved that. Our goal here is we're going to be 50 or less full-time equivalents per aircraft. By comparison, WestJet is 67. So it's a rough metric in terms of demonstrating relative efficiency. Well, how are you going to get that? Well, I'll give you an example. How many people have flown Southwest Airlines? Okay. What happens when the airplane lands? What do the flight attendants do, and what do some of the pilots do? They start going through the cabin, they're picking up and they're folding the seat belts and everything. It's called cross-utilization, okay? Southwest Airlines, the employees pitch right in, and those flight attendants are picking up the cabin, the pilots are too, to turn that airplane to get higher utilization, to get that airplane moving. That's what we're going to do at Jetlines here as well. And I got to tell you, you just can't say, you know what, we're going to start a division and we're going to get ultra-low costs. Good luck. Because when I ran Sun Country Airlines, I was on a mission to get the costs out of that organization. And you're dealing with a bow wave of tradition and culture, and Stan, we just don't do it that way here. Well, we got to do it that way here because we got to get our costs down. And you're constantly fighting that bow wave of resistance, quite frankly, on the part of people who are used to doing something a certain way. You've got to start with a clean sheet of paper. It's got to start at the top. I've got to walk the talk. If I'm demanding low costs from the organization, I've got to demonstrate low costs from the organization. It's not a soundbite that you can just throw out there and expect it to materialize.
That's fair. I guess, is it possible to share a number in terms of your CASM, maybe X, that you're working towards?
Yeah, well, I'll give you the full up CASM. On startup, it'll be 9.2 cents, and that's 40% lower than less LTM for WestJet, which is 12.6 cents. And I will also tell you, I'm probably giving some guidance here, I shouldn't, but over the 5-year period, we expect that CASM to go significantly lower as we grow and achieve the economies of scale.
That's the full-on CASM, including fuel.
Exactly.
Okay. So I guess CASM X would be somewhere in the 6-7 range if I just do the rough math in terms of where fuel would sit in?
Probably around 6 cents in that area.
Okay.
Fuel is fuel, and our projection on fuel going forward is that the curve is going to be relatively flat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess maybe one last question here in terms of Air Canada, WestJet, again, sort of giving you a bit of pushback, I know, on the competitive environment, but just if they were to price match you day in and day out, and even if they're making a loss, really they could take that for a while, to be fair, with your growth plan. So how do you overcome that issue, right?
Well, if they price below their costs, they're going to have an issue with the Competition Act, for sure, because no carrier, no operator really, can price below what's called their avoidable costs, and the avoidable costs are the costs of actually flying, number one. Number two, at my price point that I'm going to sell tickets for based on my cost structure, I can fill up 100%, and I'll stimulate demand at that price point, I'll tell you for sure. And we'll make money on every departure. They will not. I'll give you an example. When JetBlue got started in New York, American Airlines was the dominant carrier in JFK, and they did exactly that. They matched JetBlue flight by flight, price by price, and after about 6 months, they gave up and declared victory and left JetBlue alone. Why? Because JetBlue was making money on every departure. They stimulated so much demand, not only by their low fares, but also American matching them, that both carriers were filling up. Difference was JetBlue was covering its cash operating expenses. American was losing money every time they took off. So the key is low cost, low cost, low cost. You have to have the costs low enough to be able to survive in that environment. Look, we're going to get competed against, there's no doubt about it. I could give you examples of how the incumbent carriers are chasing after some of the other startups like a Flair, for instance. We're watching that. We understand what they're doing. It's not enough just to have the money. You have to have the know-how in terms of how this business operates and how to compete. And so we know what's going on. We'll be prepared to deal with that.
Okay. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how the government may be helpful to you, just as trying to create more competition in the market?
Sure. Well, first of all, they've been very helpful to us in granting us a 49% exemption for foreign ownership. The previous limitation was 25%. And because most of the risk capital for this space exists internationally, getting that exemption for 49% has been significant. That'll allow us to secure our anchor investor, if not the bulk of our funding, and then we expect to raise the rest of it domestically. In terms of competition, we have the Competition Act, and there's a process that you go through that you have to demonstrate anti-competitive behavior. Personal opinion, I'm not a lawyer, but I think there's already been a pattern established of anti-competitive behavior. Both historically, WestJet was successful in pursuing its complaint against Air Canada, and in fact generated most of the case law that exists in this topic. And so we'll be able to take advantage of that. You can also pursue a civil proceeding as well, independent of the Competition Act. We don't want to be distracted by that and by having to devote our resources to do that. But the reality is we're going to be competed with, and we have to have a strategy to defend ourselves against that. This country needs low fares, no doubt about it. And to create a division and say, well, you know, we're accomplishing all these things, we all know that's going to be a temporary measure. And then when the competition is wiped out, guess what? The airfares go right back up again. So who's kidding whom? So we're going to devote the necessary resources and the focus and the knowledge to be prepared to defend ourselves against those anti-competitive actions.
Stan, thank you very much.
Thank you.